Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Picture marching an army, 3,000 kilometers across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth.
Just a massive logistical undertaking.
Right, and then you realize that the people you just conquered have secretly allied with your worst enemy.
Yeah.
And they are literally waiting in the mountains to just slaughter your entire column. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the historical map of the Maghreb.
We are. We're looking really closely at the Muslim conquest of North Africa.
Which is a conflict that spanned a very specific, highly volatile 70-year period, specifically from 647 to 709.
And, when you look at historical maps, it's very easy to see an empire's expansion as this sort of time-lapse video.
Like a solid block of color just washing over a continent in a few seconds.
Exactly. But when we actually dig into the primary sources, the chronicles, and the archaeological evidence, we see that taking the Maghreb was a grinding, chaotic, multi-generational war.
It really forces us to discard the idea of swift, decisive victories. Our objective today is to thoroughly understand how a vast, deeply fragmented landscape,
which encompasses modern-day Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco.
Right, how all of that was ultimately brought under the centralized authority of the Umayyad Caliphate.
We really have to look at the mechanics of this transformation because, how do you conquer a territory that large?
And more importantly, how do you hold it? Especially when the local population numbers in the millions and has spent centuries successfully resisting outside rule.
Right. So to understand the mechanics of how this happened, we have to look at the board before the first pieces even move.
We need to set the stage in the mid-7th century, just before the Arab armies arrived from the east.
Because the geopolitical reality of North Africa at this time is defined by this massive, stark divide.
On one side, you have the Byzantine Empire, specifically the Exarchate of Africa, but they don't control the whole region, do they?
Not even close. The Byzantine presence was fundamentally coastal and highly urbanized.
So they clung to major port cities like Carthage and Tripoli.
Yeah, and Hadrimentum. These were heavily fortified strongholds engineered with these massive defensive walls, but they were effectively islands on the land.
So they were isolated from one another by vast stretches of territory they didn't truly control.
Exactly. And to maintain this coastal grip, the Exarchate relied on a relatively small number of elite troops.
How small are we talking?
Perhaps 15 to 20,000 soldiers at their absolute peak. And that spread really thin across hundreds of miles of coastline.
So you have these heavily armed Byzantine islands looking out at the Mediterranean. But if you turn your back to the sea and look inland, it's a completely different world.
Oh, entirely. It's a vast, complex mosaic of autonomous Berber powers.
And this demographic reality is kind of the defining feature of the Maghreb.
It really is. Inland, you are looking at an indigenous Berber population of roughly 2 to 3 million people.
That is a huge disparity compared to the Byzantine garrisons.
Yeah, and they were organized into powerful tribal confederations and well-established successor kingdoms. You have the Kingdom of Altava in the northwest.
And the Kingdom of the Aurez in the mountainous northeast.
Right, and the Mero-Roman Kingdom. These were not just nomadic raiders. These were highly sophisticated political entities.
And they certainly were not taking orders from a Byzantine governor sitting in Carthage.
Quite the opposite. These Berber kingdoms maintained their autonomy through a really deep understanding of their rugged geography.
The Atlas Mountains, the pre-Saharan steppes.
Exactly. And through a shifting, highly pragmatic web of alliances, they fielded large armies, they collected their own taxes, they essentially governed themselves.
In fact, the Byzantine hold on the coast was so fragile that Constantinople frequently had to pay these Berber tribes to act as mercenaries.
Right, the foederati.
Just to maintain a buffer zone around their cities.
Yeah, and the complexity doesn't stop at politics. It bleeds right into the religious landscape, too.
So if you walk through a coastal city like Carthage, you are going to see Nicene Christianity.
Which is the Orthodox faith of the Byzantine emperor, deeply tied to imperial authority.
But the moment you leave the coastal plain, and move into the rural interior, the dominant religious force shifts to the Donatist sect.
Right, and Donatism was a rigorous branch of Christianity that emerged centuries earlier. They entirely rejected the authority of any clergy who had compromised or handed over scriptures during the older Roman persecutions.
So by the 7th century, Donatism was deeply entrenched among the rural Berbers.
And it wasn't just a theological difference. It carried a strong, localized undercurrent of political resistance against the imperial authority in Constantinople.
Then, layered on top of all that, you have scattered, deeply rooted Jewish communities.
Many of whose ancestors arrived during Phoenician and Ptolemaic times.
Plus, lingering indigenous syncretic paganism, where older Berber deities and ancestor worship were still actively practiced.
Or heavily influenced the local Christian customs. So it is an incredibly fractured society.
Which raises a massive question when you're reading the sources. If the Byzantine Empire is the heir to Rome, a supposed global superpower, how did they essentially lose their grip on such a wealthy, vital province even before the Arab armies showed up?
It really comes down to fiscal and military exhaustion on a scale that is difficult to overstate.
Because the Byzantine government in Constantinople had just spent the better part of the previous century fighting these absolutely devastating existential wars.
Exactly, against the Persian Empire to the east and the Avars to the north.
They had been fighting for survival, draining the treasury in the process.
Yeah, the imperial treasury was just completely depleted. This meant the Exarchate of Africa was chronically underfunded.
So they couldn't afford to pay their soldiers regularly.
Right, they couldn't repair all their fortifications, and they certainly couldn't afford to project military power inland to pacify those Berber kingdoms.
They were entirely dependent on those unpredictable Berber mercenaries to hold the line.
So the Byzantine hold on the Maghreb was already a hollow shell by the time the first Arab expeditionary forces actually crossed the Libyan desert.
This brings us to the first major phase of the conflict, running roughly from 647 to 670, the initial probes.
And we really need to look at the logistics of this because it is staggering.
In 647, the Arab commander Abdallah ibn Sa'd leads an expeditionary force out of Egypt. And the sources put this at a column of 20,000 troops.
Marching 20,000 troops, along with their horses, camels, and supply trains, across the brutal expanse of the Libyan desert is a monumental logistical undertaking.
The heat, the lack of reliable water sources, the sheer distance.
Right. They're pushing deep into Tripolitania, really testing the eastern edge of the Byzantine Exarchate. And they are entirely reliant on a fragile supply line stretching hundreds of miles back to Egypt.
And yet they managed to push through and collide with the Byzantine forces at the Battle of Sefeshla, which is in modern-day central Tunisia.
And the Byzantine defense there is led by the Exarch himself, Gregory the Patrician.
But Gregory's position was highly precarious, wasn't it?
Very. He had actually declared his independence from the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople shortly before this Arab invasion.
Largely due to intense religious disputes over a doctrine called monothelitism.
Yeah, exactly. And by declaring independence, Gregory cut himself off from any hope of naval reinforcement from the broader empire. He was entirely on his own.
So the battle is an overwhelming victory for the Arab army. Gregory is killed in the fighting, and the city of Sefeshla is sacked.
And the sword has claimed the Arab forces extracted an enormous tribute from this victory, 300,000 gold numismata.
To put that into perspective, what does that number actually mean for the regional economy at the time?
Well, it's a devastating extraction of wealth. A standard Byzantine soldier at the time might earn roughly 9 to 12 numismata in a whole year.
So 300,000 gold coins?
Is the equivalent of funding a massive field army for decades. It represents the accumulated agricultural and mercantile wealth of the entire province, just physically boxed up and removed from the local economy.
But this is where the strategy seems entirely counterintuitive to me. You've just defeated the commanding army, you've killed the regional leader, and taken a fortune in gold.
You'd expect him to garrison the city and claim the territory.
Exactly. But instead, the Arab army simply turns around and marches all the way back to Egypt. Why leave?
Because the strategic objective in 647 was not permanent conquest. These initial decades were characterized by highly organized, long-range plundering raids.
So the goal was just to test the Byzantine defenses.
Test the defenses, extract movable wealth gold, livestock, captives, and then return to safe, established bases in Egypt before the Byzantines could even mount a counterattack.
It's a logistical limitation as well, I imagine. Holding territory that far west, separated from your Egyptian supply lines by the Libyan desert.
It is practically impossible without a permanent forward operating base.
Yeah.
You cannot maintain a standing army of 20,000 men in hostile territory without a secure logistical hub to provide food, water, and remounts.
Furthermore, shortly after this raid, the Umayyad Caliphate became embroiled in the first fitna.
The first major internal civil war within the Islamic Caliphate, yeah.
So the political center of gravity shifted to internal conflicts in Syria and Arabia.
The Caliphate simply did not have the political unity, the manpower, or the resources to commit to a permanent, sustained occupation of the Maghreb while fighting a civil war at home.
So these early raids, they operate a bit like testing a physical fence around a property.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You walk the perimeter, you rattle the posts, you figure out where the wood is rotting, you find a gap, you extract a heavy toll from whatever is inside, and then you retreat back into the woods before the homeowner can grab a weapon and organize a response.
That perfectly encapsulates the strategy. They were forcing the Byzantines to reveal exactly how brittle their defensive shell really was.
And they learned that while the coastal walls were strong, the inland defense network was practically non-existent.
Exactly. But that strategy of raiding and retreating changes completely in the next phase from 670 to 683.
Right, we see the arrival of a commander named Uqba ibn Nafi. He was appointed by Caliph Muawiyah I, who has now consolidated power after the Civil War.
And Uqba shifts the entire paradigm from temporary raiding to permanent settlement. He really understands the logistical ceiling of the previous strategy.
You just can't project power indefinitely from Egypt.
No. If you want to hold the Maghreb, you need a center of gravity within the Maghreb itself. So in 670, he formally founds the city of Cairo.
The geography of where he places Kairouan is fascinating. He doesn't try to take a coastal city.
No, he builds Kairouan roughly 60 kilometers inland from modern Tunis, completely separated from the sea.
Because the geography dictates the strategy. By placing Kairouan 60 kilometers inland, Upa intentionally nullifies the greatest military advantage the Byzantines possessed.
Their navy. The Byzantine fleet completely dominated the Mediterranean Sea. If Upa had built his base on the coast, the Byzantines could have used their ships to launch a surprise amphibious assault.
Or resupply a siege or bombard the settlement.
Right. By moving inland, he forces the Byzantines to fight on land, where his cavalry actually has the advantage.
Kairouan starts as a rabat, which is a fortified military encampment, but it's explicitly designed to be a permanent capital.
Yeah, Upa oversees the construction of the Great Mosque of Kairouan. He is planting a flag and saying, "We are no longer just visiting."
With Kairouan established as a secure, permanent logistical hub, Upa launches one of the most ambitious and demanding military expeditions of the era.
He leads his forces on a deep push west, a grueling march of roughly 3,000 kilometers across the entirety of North Africa.
Pushing through the Atlas Mountains, all the way to the Atlantic coast near modern Tangier.
And the sources detail him utilizing intense methods of coercion along this route. He is demanding tribute from the various Berber tribes, forcing submissions.
And beginning the initial process of conscripting converted Berbers into his own army to swell his ranks as he moves further from his base.
Now, reading the primary Arab chronicles regarding this march, there's a very distinct tone.
Right. They portray Uqba's push to the Atlantic as this seamless, divinely ordained victory lap. He supposedly rides his horse into the ocean surf and declares that only the sea prevents him from conquering further.
But if we look at the reality of military logistics, a 3,000-kilometer march through hostile mountainous terrain must have been an absolute nightmare.
The supply lines alone would be fraying at the seams.
You've identified the massive gap there between the historiography and the military reality. The chronicles, many written centuries later, compress the timeline and gloss over the immense vulnerabilities of such an extended operation.
Uqba's column was dangerously overextended.
He was operating thousands of kilometers from his supply base at Kairouan. His troops were exhausted, their equipment was degrading, and they were surrounded by subjugated tribes who were merely biding their time.
But the critical flaw in Uqba's strategy wasn't just his logistical overreach, was it?
No, it was his diplomatic arrogance.
How did that manifest?
Well, Uqba employed a very harsh, unyielding, and militaristic approach to the local Berber populations. He treated them as conquered subjects to be exploited rather than potential allies.
To understand how detrimental this was, we really have to contrast Uqba with his immediate predecessor, a commander named Abu al-Muhajir Dinar.
Right, because Abu al-Muhajir had spent years successfully utilizing diplomacy. He forged alliances, respected local customs, and courted Berber leaders to slowly integrate them into the Arab political sphere.
But when Uqba regained command, he entirely abandoned that diplomatic nuance in favor of brute force.
He actively alienated the very allies he desperately needed to secure his long supply route.
Which brings us directly to the violent blowback of that policy. From 683 to 688, the Arab expansion hits a massive wall in the form of the Berber resistance.
Culminating in the Battle of Essaouira.
The resistance coalesces around a deeply influential figure named Kusaila, or Caecilius in some Latinized sources.
He was a Christianized Berber king of Altava and the supreme leader of the powerful Araba tribal confederation.
And the records show that Kusaila had actually been cooperating with Abu al-Muhajir earlier. He was willing to work within a diplomatic framework and had even accepted Islam.
But when Uqba takes command, he goes out of his way to publicly mistreat and humiliate Kusaila, despite Kusaila being a king and an ally.
The sources describe Uqba forcing Kusaila to perform degrading tasks, right?
Yeah, such as slaughtering and flaying sheep in front of the Arab troops. It was a calculated insult designed to break Kusaila's authority.
But this really highlights a severe miscalculation regarding the limits of military force.
Exactly. By humiliating a king who commands tens of thousands of loyal warriors, Uqba effectively guaranteed a massive insurgency. Kusaila quietly bided his time, enduring the humiliation, while Uqba's column completed its march to the Atlantic.
Then comes the trap. It's 683. Uqba's army is making its long return journey from the Atlantic coast.
They're laden with whatever tribute they have extracted. They are exhausted from thousands of kilometers of marching, and their guard is likely down because they are heading home.
So Kusaila makes his move. He slips away from the camp, rallies his Araba forces, and secretly allies with the remaining Byzantine forces in the area who are eager to see the Arabs defeated.
They lay in ambush near modern Biskra in Algeria at the Battle of Essaouira. Kusaila leverages his intimate, localized knowledge of the terrain.
He knows the mountain passes, the water sources, and the choke points.
And he traps Uqba's overextended, fatigued column in a position where their cavalry cannot maneuver effectively.
The result is a total slaughter. The Berber-Byzantine coalition completely destroys the Arab expeditionary force.
Both Uqba ibn Nafi and the former diplomat Abu al-Muhajir Dinar are killed in the fighting. The army is basically wiped out.
It's far more than just a tactical defeat on a battlefield, though. It's a total strategic collapse for the Umayyad Caliphate in North Africa.
Yeah, Kusaila doesn't simply win the battle and return to the mountains. He capitalizes on the vacuum immediately.
He marches his forces directly on Kairouan, the very symbol of Arab permanence, and takes the city.
Kusaila establishes himself as the undisputed master of the Maghreb. He successfully halts Arab expansion in the region for over a decade.
So in a matter of weeks, the Umayyads entirely lose the territory and the logistical hub they had spent the last several decades trying to secure.
And if you are sitting in the Umayyad capital of Damascus, this is an unacceptable humiliation. You have lost an army, you have lost a famous general, and a Berber king is sitting in the mosque you just built.
The response has to be overwhelming.
The defeat at Essaouira forces a complete strategic recalculation in Damascus. The Caliphate realizes that sending small seasonal expeditionary forces,
or relying on aggressive commanders operating on shoestring logistics.
right, it's entirely insufficient. Subduing a heavily populated, deeply entrenched region like the Maghreb is going to require an overwhelming, centralized, and sustained military commitment from the core of the empire.
This shift in doctrine defines the next massive escalation, the fall of Carthage and the end of Byzantine Africa.
We're now in the late 690s. The Umayyads returning, and they are no longer just probing the perimeter or relying on long-range raids.
Caliph Abd al-Malik dispatches a new commander, Hassan ibn al-Numan, and he equips him with an unprecedented force.
The sources estimate Hassan's army at 40,000 troops. This is not a raiding party. This is an army of permanent pacification, fully funded and heavily equipped.
Hassan is highly methodical. He doesn't rush the coast immediately.
No, he knows he has to deal with the inland Berber threat first, or he will end up ambushed just like Uqba.
So he marches against Kusaila and decisively defeats the Berber coalition at the Battle of Mama around 688, a battle in which Kusaila is killed.
And with the inland flank temporarily neutralized, Hassan shifts the entire focus of the 40,000-strong Umayyad army back toward the coast.
He aims the spear directly at the heart of remaining Byzantine power, Carthage.
The Siege of Carthage occurs in 698, and the tactical breakdown of this engagement provides a perfect study in contrasting military doctrines.
And the reality of siege logistics. Let's break down the two sides. On the landward side, you have the Arab forces laying siege. They have established immense overland logistical superiority.
They are utilizing vast, continuous camel caravans, moving supplies, food, and siege equipment directly from their newly reclaimed hub at Kairouan to the siege lines outside the walls of Carthage.
They have the manpower to completely encircle the city's landward defenses.
Against that, the Byzantine defense relies entirely on their maritime supremacy for resupply. Carthage is a massive fortress port. As long as the sea lanes are open, they believe they can hold out indefinitely.
The Byzantines even bring in naval reinforcements from Sicily. And interestingly, these reinforcements include a contingent of about 500 Visigothic mercenaries sent from Spain.
The Visigoths sending troops is a fascinating detail. It shows that the powers across the Mediterranean and Europe were acutely aware of the threat.
They knew if Carthage fell, Spain was next.
Exactly. But looking at the tactical layout, it feels like a mismatch of capabilities.
You have Carthage, which is essentially this heavily armored, immobile knight. Its walls and its navy make it impregnable from the sea.
But on land, it is entirely outmaneuvered by the Arab forces, who are operating more like a swarm.
Right. They use highly mobile light cavalry to control the plains, cut off any local foraging, and prevent any Byzantine breakout.
Paired with wall-scaling infantry, constantly pressing the assault on the fortifications.
The armored knight against a mobile swarm is a highly accurate way to visualize it.
The Byzantine reliance on fleet-based reinforcements over robust land defenses proved fatal. The navy could bring in food, but they could not dislodge the 40,000 Arab troops ringing the city.
Once the land encirclement was absolute, the city could not sustain its civilian and military population indefinitely, despite maritime access.
The pressure on the walls became too great, and the defenders eventually broke. The Byzantine forces, along with many of the city's elite, were forced to evacuate by sea, and Carthage fell to Hassan.
But Hassan doesn't just occupy Carthage, raise his flag, and move into the governor's palace. He destroys it.
He oversees the systematic dismantling of one of the most famous, historically significant cities in the ancient world.
The Arab engineers were ordered to execute the deliberate, methodical demolition of the city's massive defensive walls.
But more importantly, they focused their destruction on the city's harbor, specifically filling in the Khathon.
The Khathon is a brilliant piece of ancient engineering. For those unfamiliar, it was a massive, circular, artificial military port that dated all the way back to the ancient Phoenician Empire.
It had an island in the center for the admiral's headquarters and could house hundreds of warships in covered sheds.
It was the absolute heart of maritime power in North Africa.
By ordering his troops to physically haul rubble and fill in those harbors, Hassan was executing a very specific, permanent strategic goal.
Erasing the Byzantine naval infrastructure prevented any future amphibious counterattacks.
If the harbor does not exist, no Byzantine fleet can sail back from Sicily a year later, dock safely, and easily retake the city.
This deliberate act of destruction permanently shifted the locus of regional power. The coast was no longer the center of authority.
It cemented the inland city of Kairouan as the undisputed capital of the province they called Ifriqiya.
It's a brutal scorched earth logic, but militarily it is undeniable. You cannot lose the port to an enemy navy if you ensure the port no longer exists.
Exactly.
Now, with Carthage destroyed and the Byzantines effectively erased from the North African board, you would think the conquest was complete. The empire is gone.
But from 698 to 703, the Umayyads realized that the ultimate threat to their control was never the Romans on the coast. It was the Berbers in the mountains.
With the exarchate removed, the mantle of primary resistance fell to a remarkable woman named Dia, known extensively in the Arab sources as Al-Kahina.
She was a leader, often described with prophetic or seer-like qualities, of the Jarawa tribe, based deep in the rugged Orez Mountains.
And she proves to be an incredibly capable military commander. The sources describe her inflicting a massive, shocking defeat on Hassan's massive army at the Battle of Meschiana, which is also referred to as the Battle of the Camels.
The Battle of Meschiana is a brilliant example of asymmetrical, decentralized warfare against a conventionally superior force. Kahina utilized the harsh terrain to her advantage and heavily relied on pack animals to execute highly mobile attacks.
The name Battle of the Camels comes from her tactics, right? Using the animals to disrupt the Arab cavalry.
Yes, historical accounts suggest she tied camels together to form a living, physical barricade that terrified the Arab horses and broke their cavalry charges.
While her infantry rained projectiles from behind the line.
She completely broke the Umayyad lines, inflicted heavy casualties, and forced Hassan into a humiliating, disorganized retreat all the way back to Libya.
Having pushed a 40,000-strong army out of her territory, Kahina implements one of the most extreme, radical defensive policies in military history.
She initiates a massive scorched earth strategy.
Having seen the Arab armies return time and time again despite defeats, Kahina formed a theory.
She believed that the Umayyads were solely motivated by the extraction of agricultural and material wealth.
She reasoned that if she destroyed the value of the land, if there was nothing left to tax, nothing left to eat, and nothing left to plunder, they would have no reason to return.
So she ordered the systematic, intentional destruction of the region's economic infrastructure.
The scale of this is hard to fathom. The sources say she ordered her forces to cut down ancient olive groves that took generations to grow,
Tear down vital irrigation networks, and dismantle fortifications and civilian villages across a massive swath of territory stretching from Tripoli all the way toward Tangier.
We have to stop and debate this for a second. Is destroying your own people's livelihood ever an actually effective military tactic?
That's a huge question.
We think of the Russians burning their own land to starve out Napoleon, but that was trading space for time. Kahina is destroying the very infrastructure her people need to survive just to make the land unappealing to an invader. It seems like madness.
It is a measure of absolute desperation, and it requires a severe level of authoritarian control to execute. But in this specific case, it severely backfired because it ignored the deep social and economic divides within the Maghreb itself.
What's crucial to understand is the demographic disconnect here.
Kahina was a nomadic or semi-nomadic leader from the mountains. Her wealth and the wealth of her immediate tribal coalition was mobile. It was in livestock, in horses, in goods that could be moved.
But the people living down in the valleys and along the coast.
Exactly. The agrarian Berber communities and the remaining Romano-African landowners lived a sedentary lifestyle. Their entire generational wealth was invested in the soil.
In those mature olive trees, in the complex irrigation canals that kept the desert at bay.
So when she enacted this policy, she wasn't just destroying enemy resources, she was destroying her own subjects' entire world.
This tactic completely alienated the agrarian populations. It instantly fractured her delicate tribal coalition.
Instead of unifying the Maghreb in a shared sacrifice against the Arabs, the utter devastation drove desperate, starving, and disaffected Berbers straight into the arms of the Umayyads.
They preferred the heavy taxation of the Arabs to the total annihilation of their livelihoods by Kahina.
So when Hassan returned a few years later with a resupplied and reinforced army, he did not face a united Berber front.
He found a deeply divided enemy with many local factions actively assisting him or simply refusing to fight for Kahina.
Her own strategy ruined the coalition she needed to survive, leading directly to her final defeat and death at the Battle of Tabarka around 701 or 703.
With Kahina gone and the scorched earth policy leaving the region exhausted, we enter the final phase of this conquest. The strategy of integration, covering 705 to 709.
Hassan is eventually replaced by a new, highly pragmatic governor named Musa ibn Nusayr.
And Musa surveys the situation. He looks at the last 50 years of constant warfare, the devastating rebellions of Kusaila and Kahina, the sheer cost in blood and gold.
And he realizes a fundamental truth of empire. Pure military force cannot hold the Maghreb.
The terrain is too vast, the mountains are too rugged, and the Berber tribes are too numerous and resilient to be perpetually occupied by a foreign army.
You cannot garrison every mountain pass. So Musa implements a completely new approach. He relies on a classic carrot-and-stick diplomacy.
Specifically aimed at permanently subjugating the massive western tribes, like the Sanhaja and the Mazmuda, who are located in modern-day Morocco.
Musa begins by establishing a rigorous administrative system based on the Diwan, which is the official registry used to calculate taxation and military pay.
He imposes the stick, the kharaj, a heavy tax on agricultural land, and the jizya, the poll tax, explicitly levied on all non-Muslim populations.
These taxes were financially crushing for a population trying to rebuild from a scorched earth campaign. So that is the stick.
What is the carrot?
The carrot is a pivotal, highly effective compromise. Musa offered the powerful Berber tribes an exemption from the oppressive jizya tax, and he guaranteed them a share of the war booty from any future military campaigns.
But there was a condition. They had to formally convert to Islam and join the Umayyad military apparatus as Mawali.
Mawali translates roughly to clients or client soldiers, right? They are brought into the fold, but attached to an Arab tribe?
Yes, it is a system of integration. It fundamentally and rapidly changes the demographic makeup of the Umayyad military in North Africa.
The army ceases to be a purely Arab expeditionary force and becomes heavily Berber.
To cement this new alliance and prove his trust, Musa makes a brilliant administrative move. He appoints a man named Tariq ibn Ziyad as the governor of Tangier.
And Tariq is a Berber convert himself.
Precisely. Musa places a Berber commander in charge of a predominantly Berber army.
The sources cite a force of about 7,000 troops stationed in Tangier under Tariq's command.
By putting local leaders in charge of local troops and integrating them into the broader Islamic military framework with the promise of wealth and status, Musa effectively secures the turbulent western frontier.
This highlights such a timeless lesson in empire building. You can conquer a territory with swords, siege engines, and cavalry, but you cannot hold it indefinitely by force alone.
At some point, you have to find a way to align the interests of the conquered population with the goals of the conquerors.
By giving the Berbers a financial and military stake in the expansion, by literally pointing them north across the water toward the riches of Spain, Musa redirects their martial energy.
He sets the stage for Tariq ibn Ziyad to lead that famous invasion of Iberia in 711.
As we move into the final segment of our deep dive, we need to look at the long-term consequences and the total transformation of a continent, because how this history is remembered is heavily debated.
The historiography of the North African conquest is deeply complex, primarily because of the nature of the sources we are relying upon.
The primary Arab chronicles, written by renowned historians like al-Balad-Huri and Ibn Abd al-Hakam, were compiled in the 9th century. That is well over 100 years after the events actually took place.
And they were writing with a very specific narrative lens in mind.
Absolutely. These texts heavily emphasize a jihad-driven, divinely ordained conquest. They focus intensely on religious zeal, the personal heroism and piety of commanders like Uqba ibn Nafi.
And they frame the entire expansion as a theological imperative, the unstoppable spread of the faith.
But when modern historians look at the exact same timeline, the exact same battles, they often read a completely different primary motivation.
Modern scholarship often looks past the religious rhetoric and points to opportunistic structural expansion.
They argue the conquests were heavily driven by severe demographic pressures and lack of resources within the Arabian Peninsula, the mechanics of ongoing tribal migrations, and the highly pragmatic lure of extracting immense tribute and agricultural wealth from fertile provinces like the Maghreb.
They view it as a standard imperial expansion that successfully utilized religious rhetoric as a powerful unifying tool for its armies.
Our job here isn't to declare that one interpretation is a lie and the other is the absolute truth. We are presenting these differing views impartially because you need to understand the complexity of how history is recorded.
The reality of the conquest likely exists in the friction between those two motivations. Deep religious conviction overlapping with the undeniable desire for wealth and land.
Another major misconception that stems from reading the Chronicles too literally is the myth of overnight conversion.
There's a persistent idea that Arab armies arrived, presented a binary choice of conversion or death, and the entire Maghreb instantly became a homogenized Muslim society.
The reality on the ground was a very slow, highly complex pace of Islamization.
Exceedingly slow. The early conversions we discussed, like those mass conversions under Musa ibn Nusayr, were highly pragmatic.
For many Berber tribes, conversion was driven by tax avoidance, escaping the jizya, and the desire for military employment, plunder, and social mobility within the new power structure.
The indigenous Christian and Jewish communities did not just disappear in 709.
They endured for centuries.
They endured under the legal status of dhimmi. This status offered state protection and the right to practice their religion, but it imposed systemic, economic, and social disadvantages, primarily through heavy taxation and legal restrictions.
It was the slow generational erosion, the constant financial pressure, the social incentives to convert to access power, the isolation from the broader Christian world that slowly transformed the religious landscape over several hundred years, rather than a mass forced conversion at the edge of a sword.
Alongside the religious shift, we see a massive structural economic shift. For nearly 1,000 years under the Romans, the Vandals, and the Byzantines, the Maghreb was a Mediterranean-facing export economy.
It was the breadbasket of the empire, shipping massive, vital quantities of grain and olive oil across the sea to feed Europe.
But the Arab conquest, and specifically the intentional severing of those Byzantine maritime networks like the destruction of the Carthage harbor, completely reoriented the entire region.
The Maghreb transitioned into an inward-facing agrarian system. The economic focus shifted southward, heavily tying into the emerging and highly lucrative trans-Saharan trade networks.
The coastal cities became less important than inland hubs like Kairouan, which managed the exchange of goods for salt, gold, and ivory coming from the African interior.
It fundamentally changed the economic center of gravity for the continent.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a complex reality to ponder. Look at what the Umayyads achieved. They succeeded in an impossible task.
They brought Islam to the Maghreb, they ended centuries of Roman and Byzantine rule, and through Musa's reforms, they integrated the fierce Berber tribes into their military machine, pointing them towards Spain. But the way they managed that integration after the initial conquest was fundamentally flawed.
Exactly. The Umayyads maintained discriminatory policies against the newly converted Berbers. Despite being Muslims and fighting in the Caliphate's armies, the Umayyad elite treated the Berbers as second-class mawali.
They paid them less than Arab soldiers, they heavily taxed their communities despite their conversion, and they continued to demand exorbitant tribute, sometimes even taking slaves from loyal tribes.
In their arrogance, they sowed the seeds of their own destruction.
Within just a few decades of the period we covered today, this systemic inequality and harsh taxation would spark the Great Berber Revolt of 740.
And the fascinating, tragic irony of history is this. The Berbers would use the very religion brought to them by their conquerors, specifically a highly egalitarian, puritanical sect of Islam known as Kharijism, as the ideological weapon to justify overthrowing Arab rule and violently reclaiming their autonomy.
The Umayyads conquered the map, but their inability to treat the conquered as equals meant they could not hold the peace they created.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.